Thanks very much. Okay, so about me, I'm a musician by training, and what brings me to this session, which I'm super excited to be speaking as part of, is my work on assessment in a musical performance training context, in which I've used LCT to try and make sense of assessment practices, or to carve out really some starting points for making sense of assessment practices in music. So my formal training, if you like, is by way of the Queensland Conservatorium here in Brisbane, where I am. And my undergraduate degree was a Bachelor of Music, majoring in jazz performance. And these days, from the music side, I'm really more of a folk and popular musician, still a guitarist. From a research standpoint, though, that experience of those undergraduate years in particular, studying music, studying jazz, has basically all the credit for my interest in assessment. And assessment is my favorite thing. Like, I will talk to you about educational assessment for hours. And the reason it's my favorite thing is that it's crazily complex in a music scenario. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about. We've got someone else there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of specific problems that happen in a music context when we are talking about assessment and trying to undertake formal assessment activities. But I just want to say, for this talk, when I talk about assessment, I'm really referring to assessment that is formally built into a curriculum. Now, my work is mostly in the higher education space, so I'm mainly interested in do work around musical performance training in a bachelor's degree context, more or less. And to tell you a little bit about that, in a Bachelor of Music, you could expect anywhere from about a quarter to a half of the workload that a student might be undertaking to be focused on the actual performance of music itself. So that gives you a bit of an idea about where that sits in the curriculum overall. And so the arc of this talk is really about how we can use LCT to make sense of just one part of the assessment of those performances in an undergraduate context. And I'm going to focus most specifically on specialization in this talk. And it's very tempting to go into this and that aspect of the other dimensions, and it's so easy to go there. And I'm going to try my very best to begin with anyway, to stick with the specialization side of things. So I'm going to talk a bit about the problem, then I'm going to introduce specialization. And then the third part of the talk is sort of, and when I say the talk, please definitely interrupt me at any time to ask questions. The third part is going to be a little bit more of an intentional opening of a can of worms to think about how we can use some ideas from specialization to look at assessment practices more holistically. And when I talk about assessment practices, what I mean is really the cluster of things that are involved in assessment. And that includes the places that are involved, the people, the activities, the artifacts, and so on and so forth. So the whole gamut of things that come together to make up this evaluation kind of practice that's happening. And the last thing I'll say before I dive into talking about a more specific problem is that my PhD was very much, and that's what I'm speaking from here, my PhD was very much a theoretical work. So it wasn't a case study of practice. It was about connecting ideas from LCT to the problem of assessment at the general level and assessment in music more specifically. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really offered in the spirit of idea sharing and just some really basic ideas that you might find useful, or I hope interesting, from a practice facing standpoint. So the problem that we have in music, and I'm not going to share any slides yet, I'm just going to talk to you directly to begin with, is this issue of fixing a number to a piece of art. That's issue number one. And that's the issue that probably in the scholarship on assessment in music, and there is a defined scholarship about assessment in music in higher education, this is the issue that has probably received the most attention, because music is complex, it's creative, and it just doesn't fit the mold the way we quite might want it to. And to get slightly more philosophical about it, as an artifact, a musical performance is what the scholar Royce Sadler would call a divergent work, or it's a kind of work that would be produced in response to a divergent task. And that basically means that there is no single recipe that can be followed to produce a successful outcome, or an average outcome, or a poor outcome. There are many possible ways of realizing a work in response to a task. And there are many possible ways of realizing an evaluation or an appraisal of that work. That's really important to distinguish the kind of work that I'm talking about assessing here. To give you the kind of contrasting example, we could contrast this with maybe what we would call non-divergent works, where the answers or the responses are basically binary, so true or false, right or wrong. And in a music context, a non-divergent task would be something like a listening exam, where a student might be provided with a recording of a couple of chords played on the piano, and they might be asked, is this a major chord or a minor chord, or which basically is asking, is this a happy sounding chord or a sad sounding chord? And those chords have very specific components to them, and the answer includes no room for expression. So that's the first really important thing here, is that the kind of work we're talking about assessing includes usually fairly considerable latitude for expression. And the reason that LCT is so useful for this, and that specialization is so useful for this, is that it gives us a way of getting inside this problem of figuring out and talking about, and I really mean talking about, what matters when we're looking at a complex creative work, like a piece of music. And by the way, when I talk about complex creative works, I'm trying to open this up a little bit so that if you're not in the field of music, you potentially might be able to access in your own knowledge some similar examples of kinds of works that might be comparable. So specialization is this wonderful thing, because first of all, music is clearly a specialism. It involves expertise, but we have these real problems with getting to grips with what we're talking about when we're looking at it, at the artifact. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to dive into specialization. You should be able to see this. So I want to start, before we get to the actual specialization dimension, with these two words here. And this is kind of the unofficial title of the presentation. I only came up with this today, and I wish I thought of it a while ago. Technique and expression. And if I had to boil down all criteria for describing musical performances that you will see in rubrics, in all manner of official documentation about the assessment of music, and in the literature on assessing music, much of which is criteria facing, these are the two key concepts, right? So we've got technique on the one hand. It's not too difficult a concept to figure out. It's about what we do on an instrument from a fairly mechanical standpoint. But there's this other grab bag on the side of that over here, expression. And this is a word that you might see replaced with all manner of other things. Artistry, sometimes musicality, which is a bit confusing when we're talking about music. You might see originality. You might see, what else? Flair over here. There are these two, one kind of tangible thing and one kind of less tangible thing that seem to make up musical performance. And we don't have a great way of talking about it. And I'm going to show you some examples of things in a little bit that illustrate that. But I'm introducing specialization here in the context of making sense of musical performances in a way that helps us cut across this kind of terminology and this sort of bin of criteria that we have. So starting from first principles of specialization, the dimension begins from the premise that practices are about or oriented towards something and by someone. And by the way, this quote is from Knowledge and Knowers, I believe. Ooh, do we have a question? No? So our practice in specialization, it's a view that practices are oriented towards something, in our context, a musical performance for the purpose of this discussion, and by a person. And so we set up epistemic relations between practices and their objective focus, and social relations between practices and their subject, author, actors involved. Now, just for clarity's sake, I'm going to say at this point that broadly speaking, I'm going to interpret epistemic relations in terms of techniques and knowledge. And these, in the context of music as a field, are fairly stable terms. There's usually a fairly consistent understanding at the general level as to what these terms mean. Social relations, I'm just going to describe really as in terms of social attributes, as referring to social attributes in music. And this is a bit harder to pin down, as we'll see. And this refers to things like taste, expression, personal identity, things like that. And so when we fix these two concepts to sets of continua, we get the specialization plane. And I know this might be familiar to some of you, but I really want to spend time with this because this is kind of the key to the Ferrari for making sense of music, as I'm going to talk about it here. And what's amazing about this is that we're talking about degrees of emphasis. So on the vertical axis, we've got degrees of emphasis on epistemic relations, or to translate that slightly, degrees of emphasis or weakness as pertains to knowledge and skills and techniques in music. On the horizontal axis, we've got social relations, similarly a distinction between stronger and weaker, or I probably prefer the term emphasis in this context, more or less emphasized. So together these two sets of relations produce these kind of four main codes. So we've got a knowledge code on the top left here, where epistemic relations are valorized, or techniques and skills are the primary basis for achievement, and social relations are downplayed. And then diagonal, we've got the Noah code, where social relations are valorized. It's about social attributes, perspectives.
I do not want to see any berryness on my bed, okay?
How are you ever gonna know?
Oh.
Sorry about that, Jack. I've just muted it.
No, you're right. You're right. That was a happy interlude. So we've got the Noah code down here, and then in the top right, we've got the elite code, where both techniques and skills and social attributes are important ingredients to success. And I'm going to say at this point that I'm increasingly comfortable with the assertion that university music education probably fits in an elite code, particularly with respect to classical music and jazz education. Popular music, I think we could probably making different intentions about. And the reason for that is that in my experience in the sector, basically, I find it very rare that we encounter situations where technique and skills are downplayed. And that's a really interesting thing in and of itself. Diagonally opposite to that, we have the relativist code. And this is super interesting from an assessment standpoint, because what kind of assessment devalorizes knowledge and devalorizes knowing? That's, believe you me, I spent a lot of time during my PhD thinking about this and what might fit there. And one possibility might be something like awarding grades for attendance. Now, if we were talking about, you know, an appraisal of attendance, of a student's attendance over the course of a semester and their enthusiasm or something like that, we might make a case for a Noah code. But if it's purely something like, here, you get 5% for walking in the door, I'm not sure whether that's about knowledge or knowing, really. That's a little bit of an aside, but something to give you a bit of an idea about what might sit there, and really just a kind of hypothesis on my part. So to give you an example of what this stuff looks like in practice, I'm going to show you a rubric that was developed for use in a musical performance context. And it looks like this. And so my intention here is to go from the kind of conceptual framework of specialization right to concrete description for a moment, just to give you a sense of how these things might play out in an artifact used in practice. So this is a rubric that was developed, it's from 2005, and it's for the assessment of strings instruments. You can see that up here in the top left corner. And strings family of instruments includes the violin, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. And you can see that this form makes a broad distinction between two main kind of areas or categories of criteria. We've got technique, our reliable friend up here at the top. And then we have musical understanding and performance at the bottom, which is a little bit less clear. What's interesting about this is not, and this is the trap, I think, with this kind of thing. This isn't a distinction between knowledge and knowing that we're seeing here. That's, I think, a really important thing to make clear. Just because this says technique at the top of this category here, and this one says something else, it's easy to think that we might have a distinction here, that we can easily lay specialization on top of this and see epistemic relations and social relations. But if we look at what's contained within, we see some different things. So this top category here, these should have something to do with technique, we might think. But when we look at something like intonation, we see, well, okay, yes, it's about how a note is played. Intonation is about the pitch, the security of a pitch, whether a pitch is right in the middle of the note, or whether it's getting slightly higher, or whether it's getting slightly lower. That seems like a fairly technical thing, and we can sort of fairly comfortably code that as content that might be indicative of an emphasis on epistemic relations. But what about the choice of intonation? What if we want it to be a little bit sharp or a little bit flat? And this is something that you're finding some parts of the classical repertoire that you'll want to make decisions around tuning that might not necessarily be textbook accurate. And we see the same kind of assertion made about tempo down here. Now, tempo is about the speed of a piece of music. That seems like a fairly objective thing, and whether the student has steady control of that. But what about choice of tempo? This is a bit more personal. Now, who's to say which choice is right or wrong? This depends quite a bit on the particular musical discipline that we're dealing with. Within classical music is a great example of this, because some parts of classical music are extremely codified in terms of acceptable speeds at which to play music. And others are completely flexible, where it's really up to the performer to make a statement by choosing a particular tempo. So my point with this is that we have a lot of concepts here, and this is a busy rubric, right? But we don't necessarily have within this artifact a great language for talking about music. We have a lot of descriptive terms, but to actually use this in a meaningful way, we would really need to have a kind of a fairly special context where we have a small group of examiners who are well calibrated to one another's understandings. And that would run counter to my experience of higher music education, that there would be that much time invested in developing a stable understanding of these concepts. So what we can get from specialization is a way of cutting across these. And I'm just going to flip back to the PowerPoint here. So as part of my PhD, to try and figure out how we might cut across this stuff, I surveyed a stack of assessment criteria. And I'm going to give you a sample here of just the kinds of things that came out of that. And I'm going to reference 3 groups of authors here who came up with their own typologies for assessment criteria in music. And you'll see probably some by now familiar things. We've got Blomen and Karnikow who came up with 8 categories. And again, we see the familiar technical, analytical stuff up the top here. And then we've got more social relations-y, appreciative, personal, interpersonal things down here. And then we have some other interesting things like hard to measure on-stage criteria. What goes in there? Criteria particular to the rehearsal process. That sits outside the actual assessment event. Okay, so it's not really an easy to use, clear device in and of itself. McPherson and Schubert in 2004 came up with a fairly, I want to say fairly influential for the time, 4-way distinction between kinds of criteria for musical performances. Again, we have technique, interpretation, expression, and communication. And then finally, Bill Wrigley in 2005, it was Bill's rubric that we saw earlier. Bill came up with different categories for different instruments. And I should probably point out at this juncture that I'm not making an argument at this point about whether more or less is right or wrong. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we have a lot of ways of talking about the same thing that change over time and aren't even necessarily consistent around the same time period. If we consider this is 2005 and this was 2004. So the efforts, one of the efforts of my PhD was to build a fairly generic translation device really to facilitate communication about what we mean when we're talking about what matters in the appraisal of a complex work like a piece of music that has many possible criteria that could feed into that appraisal. So I'll show you what this looks like here. Now, the caveat to this one is this is not how I would put this table together again if I were doing it now. So apologies in advance for the arrangement. I don't think it's particularly great. Ignore these 2 right columns here just for the moment. I want to talk about the left 4 main columns across here.
Jack,
on the left side,
just ask you a question.
Sure.
Yeah, what kind of data is this translation device to? Is it for things like rubrics or? Yeah,
so this is a combination of literature, so criteria pulled from literature about the assessment of musical performance, much of which were in themselves meta-analyses of other groups of articles that basically discussed and proposed groups of criteria for assessment. So it's very much a grab bag. And the purpose of it, when I say it's kind of a generic device, is that this is intended and was developed really for practitioners as a starting point for a conversation. So this isn't the product of an analysis in a particular context. This is a starting point for calibrating specialization to a particular scenario. And what you've got here is basically criteria set out in increasing levels of granularity. It gets finer grained as we go across to the right. So we've got epistemic relations on the left and social relations over here on the bottom half of the table. And as we've talked about, epistemic relations manifests as an emphasis on technique and skills, knowledge, broadly speaking. And social relations has to do with personal attributes, taste, self-expression, and relationships. What is particularly probably useful in the context of working with practitioners on their assessment practices, certainly from my experience, are these three columns here. So we've got here some more general terminology that helps us to understand what we're talking about when we say epistemic relations, and what kinds of terms we might expect to find in a technique-oriented discussion about musical work. Now, these aren't absolutes. As I said, this is generic. In order to use this in a very specific context, we would have to calibrate this, we'd have to tweak it, we'd have to make modifications that were sympathetic to the circumstances of a particular situation. I think that's a really, really important thing to say. And then over here, we've got more substantive possibilities for how these more general terms could be realized. These are kind of more specific points, if you like, or points of reference that you might find embedded within these more general concepts over here. So we might say of a particular musical work, oh, gee, that was great. The student had fantastic technical control, or their technical control was woeful. The rhythm in particular was great or was lacking. And we can apply this same kind of broad logic to social relations. And we get a similar set of distinctions over here. And then these two right columns on the side here are basically intended just to show that we have a continuum of strength in play. So techniques and skills can be more or less important in a context, theoretically. And social attributes can be more or less important in a context, theoretically. And the mix of those things can change. Now, I think, I always get the feeling when I'm talking with an LCT audience about this that I'm kind of stating the obvious a little bit. But that, from a practitioner standpoint, is a really, really important thing. And the reason for that is that it gives us a language for talking about this complex process of evaluation that is usually collaborative. So we'll often have multiple assessors assessing a single work. And these are not always straightforward conversations to have and straightforward assessments to undertake. And I'm going to show you here, I'm going to narrate for you an excerpt from an interview that I did with a saxophonist, someone in a classical department here in Australia, who was talking about their experience assessing as part of a panel where the student who was being assessed was a violinist. And this person said to me, okay, I remember one instance where I was on a panel of 3 people for a violin recital. And it was really interesting that myself and the other non-string person were really captured by the musicality of this performance, and it was really engaging. They had a relationship with the performance, is the analytical inference here. The whole thing from start to finish really had us engaging in the music, engaging in the world that they, the student, were presenting in the genre they were presenting. And they said the string specialist at the time wanted to mark down this student significantly because they knew the piece so well. And this is where we're seeing an emphasis on epistemic relations, techniques and skills, and also here idiomatic knowledge of this music start to creep in. And they said, according to this interviewee, the student didn't use this particular fingering, they missed out one particular thing, one phrase wasn't executed properly, and so on and so forth, etc., etc. And this person told me that it was quite a heated debate for a while, and it wasn't one of the usual 10 to 15 minute discussions after a recital. And bear in mind here that a recital, a a musical performance recital could go on for 40 minutes to an hour. The discussion itself went on for almost half an hour, 40 minutes. And this is an example of what we would call, from the perspective of specialization, of a code clash. And this is why a generic translation of specialization for a context like music potentially becomes useful, because we're able to say something about the reason for which these two people disagreed. And to illustrate what this looks like on the plane, we can see, oh, it appears my clash diagram has disappeared. Well, I'll pull up another plane instead. So what we're seeing here is a clash essentially between the knowledge code and the knower code, an emphasis on epistemic relations and on social relations. And the use case here, I think, for a calibrated specialization framework for talking about assessment is that it gives us a way of cutting through the range of possibilities, the highly populated internal language of the discipline, to get at the underlying principles at play that help us to explain what we mean when we're making a case about the quality of a piece of work that might be different to what someone else is saying. Now, this is useful for looking at actual pieces of musical work, but the interesting thing that you learn when you start to chat to people about assessment and about how they grapple with this problem of assessing music is that there are a lot of related other problems that seem to have their basis in similar material. And it was amazing when I was doing my PhD how quickly we would get off the topic of actually assessing students' work and talk about the legitimation of other things that were related to that practice. So here's another example from an interview to illustrate what I mean. This is from a person who wanted to have their instrument name redacted so that they wouldn't be identifiable as a famous practitioner and performer on this instrument. And they said to me, I feel very strongly as this particular type of instrumentalist that it's a great disadvantage to instrumentalists, and they mean students who play the same instrument, and to their marks if they're not assessed by a specialist. And specialist is the key word here that flags to us that this is about specialization, but we might be heading in a different direction to discussion of the work itself. This person told me that they think it's a real flaw at a lot of tertiary institutions, tertiary music institutions, that they don't want teachers to assess their own students. So they put in someone from another instrument. And this is a matter of policy at, I want to say, about half of the universities in Australia that offer music programs, that teachers will not be allowed to assess their own students. This person said, as this particular kind of instrumentalist, my instrument is really highly idiomatic. We don't have the wonderful big standard repertoire that a lot of other instruments have. And what they mean by this is that some instruments, like the violin and the piano, have had a very broad range of music composed for them. And so the general understanding of music written for those instruments might be higher than what it is for more niche instruments, or instruments that have a shorter history. They said it's almost impossible, and this is I think a really interesting assertion, it's almost impossible for someone who plays a different instrument to tell whether a piece is difficult or not. You find cases of people having good students and giving them a really difficult piece, and the piece is outwardly unimpressive, and the student gets a really bad mark. And this is, I'm a guitarist, this is really true of the guitar. A piece can be very complex to play from a technical standpoint and from a musical standpoint in the sense of interpretation, but that's not always obvious to the uninitiated, basically. by comparison, this person felt that students who play, or in this case, who played an outwardly impressive piece, who actually isn't maybe the greatest guitarist, and just got given that piece because it's easy to play, might actually get a better mark. This is really interesting to think about in comparison to the previous example where we saw this clash between groups of assessors who were perhaps grappling with this very issue, that some of the assessors made sense of this performance in one way, in terms of a holistic experience of the music, and other assessors made sense of the performance from a very technical standpoint, where their barometer for quality emphasized technique. And this person that I spoke to said to me, I know this happens a lot. And then the teacher has to say, well, hang on, we need to think about, I believe they're implying here, the technical aspect of things. They went on to say that if you've got 4 specialist teachers of one kind, say 4 violinists, and they mark each other's students, I think that's much better than if you've got 1 violinist and then another kind of specialist marks their students. So for instance, a brass player marking violin students. Unless they know a lot about the instrument, I feel that it's a disadvantage to the students. Here, and they mean in their context, someone who plays a different instrument has been marking my students for the last 25 years. And even though he doesn't play my instrument, he knows a lot about it. And I found that that in all the assessments we did last year, we completely agreed on everything. I think it's important for there to be communication between the examiners, particularly in a situation where you can ask, is this piece difficult? Because if you don't know, you can't possibly make a judgment. I think this is fascinating because we've gone from legitimation of students' work to legitimation of people using fairly similar set of materials as the basis for that legitimation. And I think it highlights, again, from a practice-facing standpoint, with a view to implementing specialization and frameworks that we might develop using specialization or calibrate using specialization, the importance of realizing that assessment is a messy practice and we need to be really careful about distinguishing focus and basis when we are deciding to do something in that context. And again, focus here really just refers to what is being discussed. And we've just seen a focus shift, and it's shifted because this is the way that I've presented the data, from earlier in the discussion, focus on musical performance, which is where we started, and later in these recent examples to a focus on people. But the basis for how these two things are being legitimated in the same ecosystem of assessment has remained consistent and can be analyzed and theorized using specialization. I'm going to say a caveat here is that there are other, I think there are certainly other dimensions, LCT dimensions in play, and I've explicitly avoided bringing those into the conversation. But it helps to illustrate, I think, that assessment practices involve more than just the product that we are assessing. I can't emphasize that enough. And the reason that I emphasize that so strongly is that if you look into the literature on assessment, particularly assessment in higher education, which is kind of a different literature to assessment in education generally for some reason, we see a really strong emphasis on the mechanics of assessment and how we assess products of student work in trustworthy and reliable ways. And we see a real gap from the perspective of the legitimation of people involved in assessment, when clearly this is a really important thing in the mechanics of practices themselves and all they involve. So the point I've been trying to make here is basically that we can use specialization in the context of making sense of complex creative work. And that's a good thing, I think, that a good thing to do, and it's useful to us in enabling conversation about complex work that has a strong internal disciplinary language built up around it. But that if we look to the side, we might find other things paired up beside that to which we might orient the same device. And again, this was all about building starting points. So I'm not making the claim here that that device that I showed you earlier is directly applicable across the board, but rather that it provides just starting points for figuring out when the change is desired or when things aren't working, where is the crosstalk happening? I'm going to show you one more way, and I'm trying to cap it at 15 minutes to an hour before we have conversation, because I really love to have some conversation. I'm going to show you one more way that we might be able to extrapolate using specialization to think about assessment from a more holistic perspective. And that is to use it to look at curriculum. And I'm going to switch back here to this document. I'm going to show you an excerpt from a piece of curriculum documentation publicly available from the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University. This little block here discusses the criteria that would be applied in an assessment of students' work in a particular course. And they make the distinction here between musical craftsmanship and musicality and artistry, which are kind of our old friends at this point of epistemic relations and social relations implied. And they provide some more specific examples down here that help us to make that distinction. But what they tell us is that the emphasis on these two things will change over the course of an entire degree. So we see written here, in years 1 and 2, greater importance will be given to basic craft, which I'm analysing for the purposes of this discussion as an emphasis on epistemic relations or a knowledge code. And that in later years, musicality and artistry will be accorded increasing importance. So we might see a shift into the elite code there. Now, this is interesting in light of some comments from another interviewee that I spoke with at another conservatorium in Australia. I'm not telling you the names of these institutions because the groups of people involved are very small and it's very easy to identify who might be saying what. And this person questioned the distinction between the two. They said to me, I don't think even the most clever teacher could really come up with a way of examining in the way that I would like to teach, where you're concurrently addressing technical work such that you can apply that to a musical performance. And this person went on to explain that they felt that divorcing the two could be dangerous. And the reason that they said this was that moving from an emphasis on techniques and skills in assessment, and that's what they've called craft over here, and art being a more complete assessment of a musical work that probably sits perhaps in an elite code, is actually quite taxing for the student. And the reason that this might be the case over the course of a degree is that assessment in music degrees is usually arranged over the course of the 4 years that it usually takes in an alternating fashion. So students will have what's often referred to as a technical exam or a technical jury that still involves the performance of complete musical pieces, but with a technical kind of focus to them. That might happen halfway through a semester. And then at the end of the semester, they'll have a more fully fledged performance. And they usually tend to rotate between the two over the course of a degree. And this particular person felt that this can, in some cases, cause the house of cards to fall over. String players get repetitive strain injuries, brass players have embouchure problems, which is to do with the lips, and so on and so forth. And this person's theory was that this had to do with the enormity of learning that much material and having to cycle between these really technically intense things and these more holistic elite performances. And they said to me, my whole pedagogical approach is really working on students' craft such that they can be musical, but I think divorcing them is dangerous. And again, I'm not presenting this to you as a claim about the field or about this particular context. I'm presenting this to you in the context of developing a starting point for how we can use specialization to make sense of assessment at a broader level than what we've been talking about so far. This is just one example of that. We could analyze it like this, using a specialization tour, where students might be at a certain point in the curriculum working with or directed by assessment that requires a technical focus, and then transitioning across to what I've called here art making, but music making that involves a more elite, falls into more of an elite code, and they might be involved in this dance between the two. This is really interesting because we can see where the emphasis might lie across a curriculum through the lens of the assessment events. And finally, and this is the last point that I want to make, the other reason that this is potentially quite useful is that it allows us to hypothesize what alternative practices might look like. And I think that is, again, from a practice-facing angle, one of the main things to take away from this is that if we have a problem, like this interviewee has identified here, which we can realize as perhaps a tour that looks like this between knowledge code and elite code, or between an emphasis on technique and skills and more holistic artistic production, we can begin to question what else it might look like. So what does a Noah code assessment look like? That's an open question. There's very little, again, particularly in classical and jazz programs, which are where I spent most of my time, very little that I've seen that really is evidence of Noah curriculum in those programs. And again, I suspect this might be different in a popular music context, but to finish with a personal anecdote, it reminds me of my time again as an undergraduate student. When I was in my very first year, there was a lobby from the students to basically to instigate a new course that would be focused entirely on listening and appreciation. And the idea being that we would listen to music and become familiar with the repertoire and learn to have a relationship with the music. And it never got up because there weren't enough course codes, and so we never went forwards. But I certainly have cause to wonder what would my experience as an undergraduate student have been if I had this kind of Noah pedagogy, and by extension of that, Noah assessment, Noah oriented assessment, built into the curriculum. That's an open question. So that's the end of the formal presentation part. It's just about 4 o'clock here, Queensland time. I'm really keen to know what you think. I'm so interested to know how you might work with these ideas. As I said, this was intended as a really practice-facing presentation, really just to propose simple starting points for others who might be interested in working with these ideas. So thank you very much for listening.
It's a sort of silent, applause there from people who are muted. Oh, people just jump in. You don't need me to curate you, so or whatever the word is, moderate you. So just jump in.
Can I ask a question?
Is that Mandy? Hi, Mandy.
It is. Hi, Jack. Thank you so much for that. I mean, you know, as a musician, I've been there. I know exactly, everything is so familiar, what you're describing and talking about. the dilemma or the arguments after an examination between examiners, what's, what we're really listening for and what we can see. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. But I wondered if, what were the wisdoms for you that come out of it in terms of making assessment better in the future? Did you come to any of those sorts of conclusions?
So this is my personal angle on it. My personal conclusion about that is that it has to do very much with the terms of the conversation that we might be having in a given context. And the situations in which we might find ourselves calibrating to one another and sharing information about our interpretation of meaning in relation to music, basically. Often I think this happens during moderation, but you will see in some places this idea of calibration as a practice that happens outside of moderation. So an explicit event that's programmed throughout the year for educators to share their interpretations of standards and criteria. And I think that is a very useful thing when it happens, but I think that probably the blind spot is to do with how to not reach agreement, but how to have a productive disagreement and to find harmony, not to be cliche, but to find harmony in that disagreement, if that makes sense. So for me, specialization offers a useful device for that. Implementing this into practice, it's something that I've dabbled with in my own context a little bit here and there. That is ground to be broken, I think. The other thing that I didn't really talk about is the traditionalness of musical performance training environments, highly traditional contexts in which change is typically very, very, very slow. So yeah, I'm open to ideas on that one.
Yeah. I was just thinking, if people were, if more and more people in the field were aware of that, the sort of tension between the ER and the SR, I think it would inform their own judgments and the way and the conversations that we're having about assessment, to understand which things can be pinned down and which things are really very subjective. But a balance between what are we looking at here and are we looking at different things when we assess this piece? Yeah, anyway, it's really useful work, so thank you.
Jack,
Thanks,
thank you so
Karen,
much
hello.
for that. So Jack and I have a side project that we're going to be working on. LCT 4, here we come. It is 4, isn't it, Carl? Yes, it is 4 next year. I had a question because I made a comment in the thing over there about, and I've made a comment in our notes about employers of engineering students using the word hands-on, and how it really bugged me because the word hands-on suggests knowery stuff, and yet it's a catch-all for a strong foundational for something that's there. You can only be hands-on if you already know something, okay? But that initial observation, and I've likened it to that X factor. So the X factor in a performance, and we see this in, and I was wondering from the accounting people in the conversation here, that X factor, which in engineering translates as those students, and then in the early employment, they're really successful, who jump in, they're not afraid to try things. They have this whole kind of, I call them the trial and error students. They don't sit down and do what the standardized requirements are, analyze, follow this whole kind of linear, very technicist approach to, let's say, solving a problem or designing something. And I equated that to, or I can see the parallels there in terms of the kinds of performance you're talking about, where, again, it depends on the orientation or the basis of the assessor, let's say in a panel assessment. And So there are lots of parallels there. And I was wondering how this plays out in accounting. And my question to you is, are we then really looking at making the basis more explicit, that productive disagreement? In other words, if we're all ostensibly focused on something specific and you're sitting with this rubric, are we actually saying, before we do that, let's just interrogate the basis of what it is we're going to be assessing, where we're coming from? And well, again, in standardized areas or fields like engineering, there is this assumption that they all interpret the rubric in the same way. And I mean, that's already been proven false so many times, where even engineering deans across our country couldn't agree on what do we mean by demonstrate engineering principles, you know? So that's a question for you. Are we talking about making the basis more explicit?
I think so. Oh, I certainly think that would be productive. What I think you touched on there is something that I didn't include in this presentation because it would be a whole other thing, which is the assessment strategy itself. So how do we set up the assessment event to actually work? And this is, I think, particularly important with respect to our management of criteria. And a point of hot debate in the assessment of music is whether we subscribe to a strategy that's more analytic in the sense of prescribing criteria before the fact. We can contrast that with a holistic model, which basically leaves the set of, in its most extreme version, leaves the set of criteria open. And I think the interesting thing about those two in comparison is that they leave latitude for assessors to behave in considerably different ways when it comes to collaboratively making meaning about a student's work. I'm sort of skipping around your question a little bit, I think. But I think I would be interested to know, rather, what the difference is between these two kind of approaches and whether they lend themselves to intrinsically to an emphasis on one or the other basis for legitimacy of the student's work. And also whether the choice of assessment strategy has a relationship to the potential for productive disagreement. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
No, absolutely. And it's planted a lot of other seeds in terms of, because we've experienced that in the paper that I put in the chat. The whole point was, and Carl, some of you know, Cecilia Jacobs had said to me in the very first time where I realized that in a multidisciplinary field like mechatronics engineering, where I pulled a panel together of industry and other students and interfaculty, and etc. There was we unpacked the criteria together, and there was an absolute lack of, it was then that it became obvious to me that these assumptions we have about people interpreting even the most rigorously elaborated rubrics and assessment criteria, we have so many assumptions about their understanding of these things, the collective understanding of these things. And when industry and academia engaged with discussing what those criteria meant, even the descriptors, there was absolutely no agreement. And an assessment session that was meant to last an hour around one student ended up running into 2.5 hours. And I had Cecilia Jacobs saying to me, you should have actually let it go because this is really potentially productive. And of course they were, but there is that. But I do think that's a kind of conversation. And the only way that played out was that, and somebody commented over here, the thing about taking time, it's right at the top of the chat. That only resolved itself 5 years down the line after many of those same assessors from so many different spaces came into that same assessment space every year and kind of practiced, and it formed a kind of a community of practice approach. In other words, collectively, they then developed a kind of expertise. Which one assumes is in your faculty or in your music department, one assumes that well, if it's collective assessment, that would be there. Is it collective assessment? It is panel assessment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just got into the chat and I'm having a scroll. Kat, you asked if it was all performance-based. My PhD was all about performance training.
Yeah, sorry, that was answered a long time ago.
Oh,
Thank
right,
you.
okay.
Yeah. I was too quick.
You know, it was an interesting thing for me. You know, the journey of PhD, as you all know, is sometimes a radical difference from start to finish. And LCT came onto the scene for me about, I think I read the first thing to do with LCT about 8 months in, and I was only really late the next year that it was clearly going to be the key, the project. And at that point, I was very committed to musical performance, but where it ended up was actually the subtext to the thesis that came out was that musical performances from a certain standpoint are not all that different to a lot of other kinds of work that are produced in other fields that we might characterize as creative or complex. If we're talking about the challenge of making an evaluation about that work that involves a constellation of criteria that could be changeable and hidden.
Jeff, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The thing that confuses me about it is that I can't see, or maybe there is a way, how you can demonstrate your knower qualities without having the techniques in an assessment situation. Your mention of a listening course, I can understand that. You could understand theory and have a very rarefied appreciation of music, and maybe those wouldn't be so desperately interdependent. But how do you demonstrate your social relations, if you like, in music without the quality of the performance being there technically? Not saying that a technical performance is perfect, it's often lacking any of that. But unless your technical's good in the beginning, what do you do? How do you do that? Or does it bounce back and forth on complexity of the task?
I think that's a really good question. I thought about that a lot over the years, and I'm going to connect this with the comment that Christine just made in the chat, which was to do with the extent to which I dealt with popular music performance. And in my work, I've dealt less with popular music performance, which I suspect, and Christine, maybe you can comment on this, is perhaps the bastion of the Noah code, but I might be wrong about that. And the reason that it ended up that way was that I was interested, well, I ended up looking at or orienting my study around courses that involved musical performance assessments. And at the time that I started, there was less of this in my immediate sphere of musical coursework and popular music. So that's a blind spot in my work for sure. And I think things would be potentially very different in that context. So the first part, I suppose the first part of my answer to your question, Jenny, is that I think that we would see a difference in musical disciplines as to the extent to which we could, as to the extent to which technique might be a prerequisite for achievement, no matter what. But I think the story can shift a little bit if we are thinking from a pedagogy standpoint, perhaps, rather than an explicitly an assessment standpoint. There are a small number of courses that I'm aware of that are usually electives within Bachelor of Music programs that are, I suspect, Noah code oriented, if you like. And that coursework often involves students leaving their instruments out of the room, and they will do things like abstract sound making exercises, where they might go into a room and they'll have a whole arrangement of strange objects, and they will make sound and learn something about their relationships with the other people in the room, and with the practice of making sound by using those objects to make some kind of music, moving around the space, interacting with the other students, basically on terms that are technically, intentionally very unfamiliar. I think there's interesting scope there for us to explore in the more conservative traditional disciplines like classical music and jazz, again, which is definitely my background and standpoint. There's scope for us to explore what might be available to learners if we were to include that curriculum, those kind of components to curriculum more explicitly, because it seems to me that they have a stronger emphasis on particularly relationships to sound and relationships between performers. But I think your point is really good. I think in some disciplines, as many of the people that I spoke to in my PhD study pointed out, technique is a prerequisite.
Mm.
Anybody else?
Hello.
Sorry, hi, Jack.
Thanks.
Oh, we have two at once.
Luke, go ahead.
Okay, you go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, you go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Jack, thank you so much for your presentation. Really fascinating insights coming out, and I think that this is something that we've really grappled with in teacher education, where you go in to assess a student's lesson, and there are all kinds of things. And you know, what do you focus on? And the rubrics that that are often used are so atomized and so disjointed that they actually fragment the practice, and then you don't get a sense of kind of the global holistic how everything hangs together. And it's kind of becomes then an arithmetic thing of just adding up the bits. And just one of the things that we found quite a useful innovation, because we've got, obviously it's not the same, because we've got thousands of students and hundreds of assessors, and you know, we've got to get some kind of consistency. And what we found has worked incredibly well, and it's used now almost in many places across the country, is a two-dimensional grid where we have the one dimension on the one axis and the other. So one could have, for example, the techniques against the expression, because you might have a situation where your music is like technically very good, but the expression is completely lacking. Or you might have lots and lots of expression, but the technique is very lacking. Or you might have like a distinctive performance where both of them come together in very in ways that the whole thing just gels. That X factor that I think Karine was talking about. So what we've actually been able to do, and I think that this goes really so well to the elite code, where you're not just looking at the techniques in isolation and the expression in isolation, but how the two come together in the actual performance. And what our grid looks like is 5 levels of, I'm just going to use this example, 5 levels of expression, from a lack of expression to complete a nuanced interpretation, and then 5 levels of technique. And then within each block is a range of marks. So it could be, between 60 and 65 or whatever. Mm. And what we've actually found is enhanced consistency across different evaluators, because basically what the 2 questions they ask themselves, without getting into the nitty-gritty, is number 1, on what level of expression would this be? And on what level out of the 5 of technique would this be? And then where those two intersect gives a mark range. And then you can start looking at, okay, so let's talk about what was particularly good or bad and so on. But then they're working within a mark range. It's not ideal. No giving a mark or a number to a practice or a performance is ever going to give a full nuance of the complexity of that. But just in terms of assessment, it was just a way of getting that kind of consistency and working without fragmenting the practice where the actual essence and the substance and how it all hangs together is compromised. So I mean there is a paper that I've written, but it didn't use LCT, but I would love to rewrite that paper in terms of how those come together in a holistic way. So anyway, it was just a thought.
Something that we did at UQ earlier this year was we actually built what we ended up calling a flexi rubric, and I'm straying outside the bounds of what this talk was about when I talk about this, because we actually use semantics to a very small degree to get around the issue of specification. And it hasn't really been in play for long enough for us to know to what degree that tool has been useful or not. But we essentially provided a series of indicators. We provided a very broad range of grades on one side. So UQ uses a 1 to 7 scale, where 4 is a pass and a 7 is a high distinction. And we provided a range of indicators that were basically, they use semantic gravity to distinguish fine-grained specific types of criteria that might relate to a particular work at a particular level of achievement, from broader criteria. And the point with that device was to show that we could have criteria that were both broad and narrow in their application to a work, but that they could coexist beside each other. That's another interesting little thing. And we never got to including aspect of specialization in that, but yeah, it's a great idea.
Hello, Jack.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, hi. So you have talked about specialization tools, from technical work to art making to cultivation of attributes and vice versa. But then you have left the relatives code in the dark. As you know, yeah, the relative code is legitimate in its own way. So is it possible for you to identify, something about musical performance that belongs to the relative code?
Thus far, I have failed, and I would love some suggestions to that point. It depends, I think, a little bit to do with your standpoint on the legitimacy of certain kinds of criteria, generally speaking. And again, I always come back to student attendance as an example. So in some systems, student attendance is perceived as a legitimate criterion for the assessment of students' overall achievement in a course. And in other places, it is mandated in policy that attendance not serve as the basis for student achievement. So I think it depends on the sector in which we're operating. And you're very right to point out that I didn't include the relativist code in that tour. And I think that probably reflects my own biases. And I didn't actually think about that until more recently. so it's a good point. I still struggle to find things that go there, but Karen, you look like you're about to
explode, because
Yeah.
as you were talking earlier, and when Liu asked the question now, I realized all those things that we often lump on the specialization plane under Noah as a disposition, things like the arbitrary but necessary administrative elements of, let's say, being a student or being a whatever it is. And you hit the nail on the head. Things like attendance, things like, I couldn't think of anything beyond attendance, but completion of things on time, for example. You know, handing in stuff, or, you know, pitching up for work and putting your job card in, etc. We've assumed, we use the word professionalism or ethics, and I think those kinds of descriptors that we use to talk about dispositions, this space, using LCT, we could flesh that out a little. And I think Liu is right. There are elements in the relativist code that are important. So perhaps in terms of code shifting or touring, perhaps in assessing a complex performance, one could design, a la Lee's suggestion, you know, the kind of rubric. I really like the idea of putting this on a plane, quite frankly, the assessment rubric itself, where you have to meet requirements in the relativist code. You know, in other words, you've pitched up, you've contributed to X, not for any self-serving purpose or for any, you know, greater good. We could differentiate between mentoring another student or being part of a community of practice, you know, those kinds of things. But the technical things like logging on and being there and handing in, those could all be very kind of positive relativist elements. I don't know, Carl, what do you think?
It's tricky. Oh, sorry, Carl, do you have a perspective on it?
Go for it first, Jack.
I think it's so interesting because this is where LCT can rub up against other frameworks in an interesting way, which in themselves might make claims about how those different kinds of criteria, if you like, are contextualized. And I think, I think it kind of also, we kind of need autonomy a little bit in here too, to make sense of what is a legitimate criterion in a particular context as well. I find myself always lobbying for the case of the Noah code rather than the relativist, because if we're seeking to assess students on the basis of something that they have learned, that they would need an opportunity to demonstrate their learning of that, rather than that being essentially taken out of their, having that placed sort of less within their own autonomy space, if that makes sense. So the reason I use attendance a lot as an example is that it's probably easier for that one to argue that it is what Sadler would call an academic non-achievement. We award grades for attendance, but that doesn't necessarily ratify that a student has learned a specific outcome that we're claiming they would learn through enrolling in a particular course. I realize that's a contentious point. So I'm interested in that tension between the turning of potentially relativist criteria to stronger social relations. This is definitely at the edge of where I really got to in certainly in my PhD. So yeah.
Anybody have any more? We're almost at our time anyway, so it's perfect timing. But if anybody has anything else they want to jump in, there is a lot of engagement in chat as well about things like.
Hi. Yeah. Hi.
Oh,
can I add something? Again, relative code, I have read some papers about LCT concerning specialization code, and then I think in many cases the relative code is left in the dark, and it seems to be very much discriminated against in many ways. But in my teaching experience, I think I have come across a number of interesting cases which I would identify as belonging to the relative code. For example, when you brainstorm, and when you ask questions that don't have that have multiple answers, that really gives room for students to use their imagination. And
I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really good point. I mean, when we were doing the interdisciplinary, when LCT was a key part of the interdisciplinary units at Sydney University, I heavily emphasized that the relativist code was as valuable as any others for very specific purposes, like having a group brainstorming ideas before they then evaluated the ideas. It's sort of like a kind of space in which they held off judgment. So any ideas on the table without judgment, but it was a kind of like, it was a sort of space provided to just think of anything. Although after that, there was then a case of how are we going to evaluate all these ideas that we've now had as a group. So then it did then tend to shift into the other codes afterwards, but it was a valuable space in which they were able to feel a safe space for just coming up with anything. So I think it's a good point.
And a really useful analogy for that in the music context, I think, is actually improvisation, which is sometimes built into curricula of study as I suppose, a musical version of brainstorming. I'm so glad that you mentioned it, because brainstorming hadn't really occurred to me, and that's such an interesting way to look at it. And often those free improvisations, and I mean free in the sense that students might walk into a room and there is no plan about what's going to happen. But over the course of 40 minutes of knowing that they have to do something and play something on their instruments, all in the same space, usually those improvisations take a direction, and students will walk out of that room with some meaning, whatever that may be. So that's a fantastic suggestion. I'm excited about that. I want to try that out.
So does that relate to the comment that I made down there? If you lack technique and you're really very bad at it, but you're very keen in terms of music, is that a relativist code, or does it always have to be things that are necessarily unrelated? Or is that just a very poor performance?
It would depend, wouldn't it, whether keenness was an attribute that you valued in that context. And if it was, then that could be judged positively on a no code basis. But you could still be failed on your shit technique. But I wouldn't. I mean, also remember that we can't allocate anything to anything, because in one context, keenness would not be valued as a valuable issue to do with the knower. And it might be just judged if it's a knowledge code context of assessment, and then someone comes in and just shows lots of pizzazz and encouragement and gives 150%. None of the assessors will give a shit. They'll just say, yeah, that's lovely, and fail you according to the knowledge code. Yes. But I would see that as a kind of knowledge code versus knower code situation rather than a relativist code one.
Okay.
I've got to wrap us up now. We are at our limit. That's been really fantastic. Great discussion with some brilliant questions from all around the world, by the way, which is really awesome, as well as participants from all sorts of countries and continents. And this will also, Jack, if you're up for it, we'll put that on the YouTube. And Mauricio, you will send the chat to Jack ASAP, huh? so that he can get in touch with people and answer questions and follow up ideas and just, so Jack, you can engage with people in the community from the chat. So thanks very much, Jack, and to all the people who joined in and we're here and listened and engaged. Thanks everyone for being here. And I really hope that I see you all again in 2021, which simply cannot be as bad as 2020. And I guarantee you it cannot. And at our next year. So by the way, if anybody wants to do a roundtable next year, please get in touch with the centre or with myself. Always looking for people, and particularly from all around the world. So you can now jump in and do a roundtable from anywhere. So please do join in. So thanks very much, Jack. And I hope to hear from some of you. And Jack, I'm sure that you'll be connecting to a few people from here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Amazing work.
See you, everybody.
See ya.
Thanks, Jack.
Cheers, everyone.
See you.
That's a nice thing to say, Kerry. Well done, everyone. Thank you. And I will see you soon. I'm going to pop off. Mauricio, you're okay to close this off?
Yep, that's okay.
Thanks, Jack.
Carl.
Good
stuff. Good to see you again. Catch you around.
Definitely.
Thanks, Mauricio.
No worries.
Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.